eat so much Wiener Schnitzel and drink so much beer that we will go through the exact same thing that poor girl did.
I hope not. No, the sound of music will get us through.
Yes.
It will get us through, and it'll keep our spirits high.
All of that sugar will just bloat us up, and our systems will be able to take
We'll
all of
sing
that.
it out. We'll just
We
sing it
will.
out in the hills of Vermont.
Yes. But, okay, so 3 years after the Von Trapp family lodge opened, Georg, who I thought it was George for the longest time, then I rewatched the movie and I was like, Georg.
Well, it is, but I think Georg's a nickname. I think his name is George, but I think Georg is like a German nickname for George. I could be wrong. Historians,
really?
Please don't quote me, but because I did the same thing. When I watched it, I was like, Georg. But I think it's a nickname. I think it's a nickname for George.
Write in to the HollywoodBabylonians@gmail.com and tell us if Georg is a nickname for George. I would love to. I would love to know.
My heart is open to be corrected, but that is based on what I feel like I've learned. I think it's a nickname.
My brother's name is George, and I want to know if I should start calling him Georg.
Call him that George. Anyway.
But George Von Trapp, Georg, died in 1947, and then in 1948, Maria wrote the Trapp Family Singers in 1948, and she published it, and immediately Hollywood saw it or read it, and somebody from Hollywood came and they wanted to buy the rights off of her, but they only wanted to buy the title. They did not want to buy her actual story, so she turned them down. And then in 1956, German producer Wolfgang Reinhardt, son of famous film director Max Reinhardt, approached Maria with $10,000 asking to buy the rights to her entire story. And then what happened? Maria asked if she could sign on for royalties as well. And Reinhardt's agent got back to her and said, unfortunately, there was a German law that stated a German film that, it forbade a German film company from paying royalties to foreigners. And Maria was an American citizen at this point. So Maria signed the contract with Reinhardt selling off her story for $10,000. Which at the time, she was a widower with 10 children, what else was she going to do? $10,000 was a lot in 1956. It's still a lot, but it goes a lot faster now than it did in 1956. So in signing the contract with Reinhardt, she signed away all film rights, including all profit participation to her story, which is sad considering what the history that built up, the legacy that Rodgers and Hammerstein built around it. But never fear, Robert Wise came back and kind of saved the day for her a little bit. In actuality, the law that Reinhardt's agent told her about was like, we can't pay royalties to a foreigner, was a complete lie. They just wanted to buy the film royalties off of her. So poor Maria. I know. Oh, no. This story just gets sadder and sadder.
Oh, Lord.
Started off with a scarlet fever death and the end of World War I and an Austrian bank collapse, and all those little children had to go to work. In 1956, Reinhardt's company produced Die Trapp Familie, and it became a big hit, like one of the biggest hits Germany had ever seen. And then in 1958, there was a sequel also produced by Reinhardt called Die Trapp Familie in America, where the family went to America. And that was also a great big hit. So both became the most successful films in Germany since World War II and became massive hits in Europe and South America as well. And then, I believe it was 1957, Paramount Studios in Hollywood, California, purchased the film rights to the two German films as a vehicle for Audrey Hepburn, but she got the nun story, so never fear, she was not left out. And they had just hired the Broadway director Vincent Donahue to come and direct Die Trapp Familie. They were looking at it more as like a straight film instead of a musical. Well, it being a musical had never really crossed anyone's mind at this point. And Vincent Donahue was good friends with Richard Halliday and Richard Halliday's wife, Mary Martin, because Vincent Donahue, do you know what he directed Mary Martin in?
Oh gosh, what was it? Was it Peter Pan?
I think he did direct one of the television specials that she was in, but I know the big one was like Annie, Get Your Gun.
The musical?
Yeah. Did you not know that she was in that? I think she was in the Annie, Get Your Gun in California.
I was going to say, because I know the movie's Betty Hutton, but I was like, it must have been some big production. Okay.
Right. I think it was a California production. I know. Hot Dog. Yeah, because Ethel Merman was the original on Broadway.
I was like, maybe she replaced?
I know. She might have. I'm not exactly sure. We should look into that history.
I need to look into that, yeah.
But anyway, Vincent Donahue had directed Mary Martin and Annie Get Your Gun, and they were looking at, well, Vincent Donahue watched it at Paramount, and he thought this will be the perfect vehicle for my best friend Mary Martin. So he took Die Trat Familia, he took a print of that. He flew back to New York because at that time they couldn't digitally stream anything. He flew back to New York. He screened it for Halliday and Martin, and they both loved it. The three of them got together and they were like, this would be a perfect project for Mary Martin. And so they originally conceived it as a straight play. So they approached Howard Lindsay and Russell Krause, and they had written State of the Union for Broadway, which was later a film with Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn. I think they also produced Arsenic and Old Lace. Well, they later collaborated with Rodgers and Hammerstein on Sound of Music. So Lindsay and Krause got together. Martin and Halliday said, would you write this for us? And they said, sure. And they were going to include some like authentic Austrian folk songs. So they went to Rodgers and Hammerstein, Martin and Halliday did, and they said, would you write one original song for our stage play? And Rodgers and Hammerstein said, well, we don't feel like our music would merge with Austrian folk songs. They said, but we will write an entire new score and help you co-produce it. What happened next was Halliday thought he would have to buy the rights off Maria, because even though she had sold them to the German company, he didn't know that. So he wrote Maria over and over and over again. She was doing missionary work, as she did in New Guinea at the time. She kept throwing away his letters. So when she finally got back to America, when she sailed into the port at San Francisco, he was there and he introduced himself. He said, I want to turn your show into a Rodgers and Hammerstein Broadway musical with Mary Martin, my wife. And she had no idea who any of these people were. So he took Maria Von Trapp to see Mary Martin that night and Nanny Get Your Gun, and they really fell in love with each other. But he did find out from Maria that, lo and behold, she no longer owned the rights. Halliday and his partner Leland Hayward, who had been a film producer, one of Katharine Hepburn's lovers, struck up a deal with the German film company to purchase the rights to turn it into a Broadway show. And thank goodness, Halliday and Hayward ended up giving Maria 3/8. This sounds really small, but 3/8 of 1% of the Broadway box office. And she was grateful, is what the book said. I'm like, 3/8 of 1%. How much was that?
Not much.
Not much. And not much in 1959. The Sound of Music opened at the L'Enfantine Theater in New York on November 16th, 1959, and the reviews ranged from indifference to loathing. So most of the reviews absolutely hated it, as did the film reviews. The critics found it too sweet and saccharine, but the audiences loved it. When the box office opened several months before the show went up, they got $2 million in advance ticket sales. So, and then after it opened, audiences kept seeing it, and it ran for eventually 1,443 performances and won 6 Tony Awards, including Best Musical, and sold over 3 million cast albums. So it was a hit on Broadway. It was Rodgers and Hammerstein's financially, their most successful musical on Broadway. But the critics absolutely loathed it, which kind of, haunted it down the road. So on opening night, there was the Hollywood agent Irving Lazar. Irving Lazar represented Lindsay, Krause, Rodgers, and Hammerstein. And Irving Lazar was sitting in the audience with Spiro Skouras, who was at the time the head of 20th Century Fox. They were there because Fox had right of first refusal on any new Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, and they bought into that after they produced King and I, and it was an incredible success at the box office. And it also acquired the rights at the time of King and I to option any subsequent Rodgers and Hammerstein musical before any other studio. So like they were the Rodgers and Hammerstein studio, Fox was, in the 1950s. Spiro Skouras loved it, so they did buy the rights for $1.25 million. 20th Century Fox did, but they paid for it in installments because at the time they were practically dead broke. That's another story that we'll go into in just a second. Okay, so 2 weeks after the show opened on Broadway, Ernest Lehman went to see it on Broadway with his wife over a bowl of soup at intermission in the book that I was reading. They went and they got a bowl of soup at intermission. He was like, one day this is going to make a fantastic movie. So he was kind of obsessed with it from the very beginning, and he went back to Hollywood and he talked. He knew that 20th Century Fox bought the rights for it, so he was constantly talking it up to all executives at Fox all around Hollywood. If there is a Sound of Music movie musical, I want to be the one to write it. Ernest Lehman had begun as a theatrical press agent in New York. He turned this knowledge that he learned at the theatrical press agency into magazine articles and books. And he eventually took everything that he had seen gone on in this press agent's office and he put it into Sweet Smell of Success. But he started his career at MGM writing for Robert Wise for a film called Executive Suite, which is amazing. It's a totally different film than Sound of Music. He also wrote Sabrina, the King and I, North by Northwest, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So in June 1960, Fox did buy the film rights to Sound of Music for $1.25 million against percent of the gross. At this time, that was the largest sum a studio had ever spent on a literary property. Fox also purchased a 6-year option on the 2 German films, Die Trapp Familie and Die Trapp Familie in America. And what they did was to build up hype around the movie musical. They cut the 2 together to make one film, and they dubbed the entire thing in English, and then they showed it in America, which it did all right. But that was all just to kind of build up clout around the movie musical coming out. Rodgers and Hammerstein stipulated in their contract that Fox could not release the movie version until all major stage productions of the show had closed. Whilst those rights to The Sound of Music sat on the shelves of Fox and rotted away, the finances at Fox took a nosedive, and really a nosedive that had begun in the mid-1950s, and every studio was going through the same thing because television had come around. There was a great big, the United States filed a lawsuit against 6 major motion picture studios in 1948, which took a lot of money away from them. We talked about that in our last episode. It's another long story. But Darryl Zanuck had been the head of 20th Century Fox Studios up until 1956. And in 1953, because the studio was falling behind in finances, as all studios were, because people were just sitting home and watching television and listening to the radio, he came up with Boskin Loom, a new process called Cinemascope, which made everything extremely wide. And there's a very dramatic story behind that where he had this great big board of investors, and it took them so long to develop Cinemascope that the board of investors immediately started to try to pull out and file a lawsuit against him, all because of the development of Cinemascope. He eventually pushed it out too early, which if you watch an early Cinemascope film, it's like watching a movie through a fishbowl. So it wasn't completely developed until later. But because of that, he had a nervous breakdown. And then he started to have several different mistresses. And he kind of, I haven't read into this in a long time, but he did have a nervous breakdown. He had several different anxiety attacks. And his wife divorced him in 1956. Put a restraining order against him that said he could not come into California without her permission. So in 1956, Darryl Zanuck had left Fox. Spiro Skouras had took over, and he was not the leader that Darryl Zanuck had been in the 40s and 50s. So there was a lot of projects that were left uncompleted. A lot of stuff wasn't happening as it was supposed to. And then in 1958, Fox started to develop a movie that was supposed to be like a very small budgeted historical epic with Joan Collins called Cleopatra. And that quickly spiraled out of control when Joan Collins was fired and they rehired Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, and they fell madly in love on set. And then everything that you could possibly imagine went wrong on the set, like Elizabeth Taylor catching pneumonia for a very long time. Directors were fired and rehired. Producers were fired. Directors left. Actors had to be replaced. So that took like 4 years to get made. And by the time that was made in 1962, it had gone like $40 million over budget.
It was a doomed film, baby. Woo!
It was. We should talk about that. I mean, we're not even talking about the Cleopatra today, but it leads up to The Sound of Music and partially why it was created. So in 1963, Cleopatra was finally released. And even though it made an incredible amount of money at the box office, it could not recover all of the money spent on it over the last 4 years. So Spiro Skouras had thrown the studio, I believe, into around $48 million in debt. So the board of directors at Fox fired him and said, you can be chairman of the board from now on, but you're no longer head of the studio. So then they brought back Darryl Zanuck. Well, Darryl Zanuck couldn't make it into California because his wife told him he couldn't, or his ex-wives told him he couldn't. So he was in Paris running his independent film company as well, and he came to New York sometimes. But his son, Dick Zanuck, he said, I want you to go into the studio as head of production and see what you can do. So Dick Zanuck went into the studio with some big dick energy, and he got things back on track. He did. Well, we'll talk about the big dick energy a little bit later, because he's also this. He got the studio back on track for a short while, but then he made some bad calls in the late '60s, which caused the entire studio just to crumble to dust.